The air inside the chamber was electric, charged with the kind of tension that precedes a thunderstorm. Rows of polished oak benches gleamed under harsh white lights, reflecting the flash of journalists' cameras like bursts of silent lightning. Judge Brett Kavanaugh sat at the center of it all, shoulders squared, lips set, and a half-smirk that read more like entitlement than ease. He adjusted his papers with an almost theatrical calm, the kind of calm designed to project control. Yet just beneath his steady hands, a faint tremor betrayed a flicker of irritation, a man used to deference sensing it might not be coming. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, eyes narrowing, her tone soft but loaded with unspoken fire. She wasn't here to grandstand, she was here to unmask. The room stilled as she raised a single sheet of paper, her expression unreadable but her posture unmistakably sure. When she spoke, her voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Judge Kavanaugh, before you claim impartiality today, can you explain why—" She paused. The silence thickened, stretching out, daring him to fill it. The question landed with the force of a thunderclap. Gasps rose from the back rows. Journalists scrambled to adjust their lenses. Even Kavanaugh blinked, just once, but long enough for the cameras to catch it. A crack in the marble mask. This wasn't the line of questioning he'd prepared for, not the safe volley of rehearsed exchanges. This was a breach in the wall he'd built around himself. Crockett's gaze never wavered, a calm counterpoint to his tightening jaw. She knew what she was doing. In one stroke, she had shifted the power dynamic, turning a routine hearing into a battleground. The public, watching live streams on their phones, felt it too. The slow tilt from business as usual to history in the making. Tweets exploded mid-broadcast, hashtags already forming, fragments of disbelief ricocheting across the digital sphere. But the real reason this question mattered, and why the country would be talking about it for days, started long before this day in court.
Long before the cameras flickered on that morning, Washington had been bracing for impact. This wasn't just another hearing on a crowded calendar. It was the culmination of months of tension, lawsuits, protests, and whispered predictions of a showdown that could reshape the moral language of American politics. The marble halls of Congress had seen confrontations before, but rarely with stakes so deeply woven into the nation's identity. Dignity versus entitlement, transparency versus power cloaked in robes. Every seat in the chamber was filled, not simply with lawmakers and staffers, but with the invisible weight of expectation from millions of citizens who felt their future reflected in that room. Judge Kavanaugh represented one version of America, cloistered, elite, assured of its own permanence. His supporters called him a guardian of tradition, but his critics saw a gatekeeper of exclusion, a figure whose rulings seemed to echo a country that some believed had moved on, or should have. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, the living embodiment of another America, forged in neighborhoods where opportunity was a fight rather than an inheritance. Her presence alone cracked the veneer of inevitability that Kavanaugh carried like armor. She was not just a questioner, she was a mirror held up to a system unused to reflection. Outside the building, the streets vibrated with chants and hand-painted signs, immigrants and allies weaving together in a patchwork of voices. To them, Crockett was not only a lawmaker, but a signal flare, proof that their concerns could breach even the marble walls of power. The tension had grown with every leaked memo, every speculative headline about what might happen when these two figures collided. By the time the gavel struck, it felt less like a proceeding and more like the opening act of a trial between two national identities. Inside, the media framed it as a high-stakes hearing, but the deeper truth was cultural. A confrontation over who gets to define justice, whose history is legitimized, and whose dignity is recognized. The undercurrent was unmistakable to anyone watching. This was about more than one question or one judge. This was about the rules of the entire game. Would power continue to hide behind polished resumes and well-rehearsed sound bites? Or would it be forced to answer to voices that had once been silenced? As Crockett prepared her line of questioning, the quiet before the storm thickened. Staffers exchanged glances. Analysts on live television speculated breathlessly about what she might reveal. Every social feed buzzed with speculation, a digital drumbeat to the drama unfolding in real time. Even those who had tuned in casually began to lean closer to their screens, sensing something unprecedented. This wasn't just oversight. This was theater, morality play, and reckoning all at once. And in that moment, the stakes were no longer abstract, they were human. Families watching from living rooms, students texting their friends about the clash, elders remembering marches they'd joined decades before, all of them looking for a sign that their America, the inclusive and aspirational one, still had a voice inside the halls of power. Crockett's poised figure at the microphone was that sign, and even before she spoke, she'd already shifted the ground beneath Kavanaugh's feet. Yet to understand the full weight of this showdown, we have to look at who was really sitting on each side of the table.
Brett Kavanaugh's rise was scripted like a political thriller, except the plot favored him at every turn. Born into comfort and corridors of influence, he attended the schools where futures are planned, not imagined. Classrooms lined with portraits of past power brokers, faculty who quietly coach the ambitious toward clerkships, connections, and courts. Even as a young man, he learned the art of staying composed while others argued, of projecting reasonableness while wielding raw leverage. Those who knew him back then recall a calculated charm, the smile of someone already convinced of his own inevitability. His early career unfolded with a kind of preordained ease: law review, prestigious clerkships, the coveted seat advising the most powerful figures in Washington. When others stumbled over obstacles, he glided past them, buoyed by networks built over decades. In televised interviews, his voice was calm, his phrases crisp, the embodiment of judicial temperament. But the camera also caught flashes of something harder to disguise: a reflexive certainty that his interpretation of the law was the only interpretation. A faint smirk when confronted by critics. A habit of brushing off questions that landed too close to his core beliefs. Controversies gathered around him like static before a storm. As a legal advisor in polarizing cases, his fingerprints were found on memos and strategies that would later haunt confirmation hearings. Activists dug through archives, piecing together a portrait of a man who had helped shape policies, restricting rights rather than expanding them. Each revelation chipped away at the polished image. Commentators began calling him the Velvet Hammer, courteous on the surface, ruthless underneath. Even then, Kavanaugh rarely broke stride, insisting the criticism was partisan noise, refusing to acknowledge any pattern beyond his own narrative of merit and service. The arrogance was not always overt, it was woven into how he occupied space. During earlier hearings, he interrupted questioners, pivoted away from uncomfortable topics, and treated follow-up questions as if they were beneath him. Clips went viral of him rolling his eyes, adjusting his cufflinks mid-grilling, muttering under his breath when challenged. For his supporters, these were signs of composure under fire. For his critics, they were tells. Flashes of a man so sure of his elevation that accountability became optional. Media retrospectives painted the contrast in stark colors. On one side, a resume bristling with elite credentials. On the other, rulings and decisions that, to many, betrayed a worldview at odds with inclusion and fairness. Protesters outside courthouses carried placards not only against his opinions, but against what he symbolized: the entrenchment of privilege inside institutions meant to be impartial. The headlines grew sharper with each new decision he authored or supported, framing him as a gatekeeper of an older order increasingly challenged by a more diverse, vocal public. The cultural narrative sharpened in the lead-up to the hearing with Representative Jasmine Crockett. Editorials described him as a fortress of entitlement, a judge insulated from the lives his rulings affect. News montages juxtaposed footage of him at Ivy League events with shots of communities impacted by the policies he defended. Social media memes cast him as a character from a bygone era, clutching a gavel in one hand and a closed door in the other. Even mainstream anchors, usually measured, began hinting at an impending reckoning, not simply of his career, but of the model he represented. And yet, despite the controversies, his path to power remained largely unbroken. He had mastered the performance of solemnity, the cadence of legalese that masked ideological edges. To his allies, he was unassailable, a scholar jurist whose intellect shielded him from petty attacks. But to a growing number of Americans, his name became shorthand for a larger question: who does the law truly serve? That question hung over the chamber on the day Jasmine Crockett faced him. Every camera angle, every whisper in the gallery carried the weight of this backstory: a lifetime of unchecked dissent, an entire system built to ensure his comfort, now confronted by a single voice, unafraid to puncture the facade. Even before she spoke, the confrontation felt like a hinge moment, a chance to hold a mirror up to decades of quiet consolidation. And while his resume seemed untouchable, on the other side of the aisle stood someone whose life story could not have been more different.
Jasmine Crockett's story began far from the marble halls and polished wood panels of Washington. She grew up in a neighborhood where the sound of sirens was as common as the sound of church bells, where neighbors shared casseroles during hard times and whispered prayers for their children's safety at night. Her parents were the kind of people who worked 2 jobs yet still found time to volunteer at the community center. They taught her early that dignity wasn't something granted by power. It was something carried, protected, and multiplied by lifting others. This belief became the quiet pulse under everything she would do. As a child, Jasmine watched how systems ignored her community. She saw eviction notices on doors, underfunded schools, and street corners where opportunity disappeared. Her mother used to tell her, "Justice isn't the word, baby, it's a fight." That sentence lived in her bones. While classmates debated what clubs to join, Jasmine organized book drives and marched alongside her parents for local housing reforms. She learned that leadership wasn't about titles. It was about standing where it was hardest to stand and refusing to move. College was her first real glimpse of a larger world. Surrounded by students from wealthier backgrounds, she realized how much of life was decided long before a person entered a classroom. She worked nights in the library and mornings tutoring at-risk kids, never forgetting the people who had sent her off with handshakes and envelopes of small donations. Professors noticed her fierce curiosity and her unwillingness to accept surface answers. "You're going to make people uncomfortable," one mentor told her. "Good, that's how change starts." It became a mantra she carried into law school, where she specialized in civil rights and public defense. When Jasmine returned home as an attorney, she didn't join a gleaming downtown firm. She opened a modest practice 2 blocks from the bus stop. She represented people who had never met a lawyer who looked them in the eye, who could not afford retainers but deserved a defense anyway. She fought cases that were supposed to be unwinnable, making time to explain the process to families who had long been shut out of the language of the courts. Local newspapers began calling her the People's Lawyer, a title she wore with more pride than any professional award. Her reputation grew, not just from victories, but from how she treated defeat. Never bitter, always learning, always showing up again. When she ran for public office, her campaign wasn't funded by PACs or big donors. It was fueled by bake sales, car washes, and a network of grassroots organizers who saw in her someone who had lived their struggles. She knocked on doors herself, sometimes until her knuckles were raw, speaking with immigrants in their own languages,
carrying clipboards filled with handwritten notes about local needs. By the time she won her seat, she had built not just a voter base, but a movement. In Washington, Jasmine refused to be another face in the background. She sat on committees that shaped the future of education, immigration, and criminal justice, often clashing with more entrenched members who preferred decorum over disruption. Yet she understood the power of composure. In hearings, she spoke with measured precision, turning each question into a spotlight, exposing contradictions and double standards without ever raising her voice. Journalists described her as steel wrapped in velvet, a lawmaker who could dissect policy on the record and then comfort a crying constituent off it. Her values, justice, dignity, service, were not abstractions. They were born of sleepless nights studying case files, of holding the hands of mothers whose sons faced sentencing, of writing legislation in borrowed office space after hours. Unlike Kavanaugh, she had no fortress of elite privilege around her. Her armor was earned, scars from political battles, sleepless nights from personal sacrifice, and a deep conviction that systems could be bent toward fairness if someone had the courage to try. Her background also gave her an edge few noticed at first. She understood the rhythms of power from the outside in. While Kavanaugh honed his poise in elite circles, Jasmine learned how to command a room that didn't want her voice heard. While he polished his resume under the guidance of power brokers, she built hers through trial by fire, each case and campaign a test of endurance. And while he treated questions as irritants, she treated them as opportunities, a way to slice through rehearsed narratives and find the truth beneath. By the time the fateful hearing approached, Jasmine Crockett had become more than a representative. She was a symbol. To young immigrants, she was proof that someone from her background could rise without shedding their identity. To progressives, she was a sign that integrity could still win elections. To skeptics, she was a disquieting reminder that the margins could produce leaders who weren't beholden to the old order. She studied Kavanaugh's record meticulously, not for sound bites, but for the patterns that revealed his worldview. She prepared her questions like a surgeon planning an incision, precise, minimal, devastating. The contrast could not have been starker. On one side, a man whose life had been paved with influence. On the other, a woman who had fought for every inch of her platform. But she didn't frame it as revenge or resentment. For her, this was about accountability, about showing the country that no title placed anyone above the truth. That's why she entered the courtroom not with a shout, but with a calm resolve, eyes steady, voice steady, every movement telegraphing purpose. And with her experience as armor, she entered the courtroom ready for one defining question.
The courtroom felt smaller now, its walls closing in under the weight of what was unfolding. A faint hum from the air vents mingled with the relentless clicking of cameras, each flash a silent drumbeat of history. Judge Kavanaugh leaned forward, hands clasped, gaze fixed on Jasmine Crockett with a practiced expression of judicial patience. But his fingers tightened around each other, knuckles whitening. He sensed he was no longer steering the exchange. Crockett began her line of questioning slowly, each inquiry shaped like a scalpel rather than a hammer. "Judge Kavanaugh," she said evenly, "when you issued your opinion in a Madison case, did you consider how your interpretation would affect those most directly impacted?" Her tone was measured but unflinching, the kind of voice that demands an answer without ever needing to raise in volume. Kavanaugh's lips twitched. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, that's a mischaracterization of—" He cut himself off, adjusting his tie, as if to signal restraint, but his eyes betrayed irritation. The tension was visible to everyone. Staffers exchanged wary glances. The audience stiffened in their seats. On social media, live tweet threads exploded. "She's cornering him. Watch his face. He's losing it," posted another. Split screens on news channels showed Crockett's unwavering gaze alongside Kavanaugh's shifting posture, a duel playing out in real time across millions of screens. Kavanaugh tried to regain control. "Congresswoman, if you're asking whether I've followed the Constitution, the answer is absolutely. And, frankly, I find your suggestion otherwise." He stopped again, this time mid-sentence, as Crockett cut in with a simple yes or no. Her interruption was surgical, delivered without malice, just a crisp demand for clarity. The audience gasped at her boldness. Even the stenographer paused for half a second, eyes flicking up, before resuming the keys. He leaned back, forced a smile, and tried a different tactic: condescension. "I appreciate your passion," he said, his voice dripping with what was meant to sound like magnanimity, "but perhaps you don't fully grasp the legal complexities at play." Crockett didn't flinch. "Oh, I understand them perfectly," she replied, her voice as steady as before. "I'm asking about the human cost." The chamber vibrated with a murmur of approval, the sound of onlookers choosing their side. Each exchange ratcheted up the suspense. Kavanaugh's interruptions became sharper, his sentences longer, packed with legal jargon like barricades. Crockett's counterpoints were shorter, cleaner, slicing through the verbiage to reveal contradictions. Her composure functioned as both shield and sword. With each question she pressed, he lost another inch of the authority he had carried into the room. Outside the chamber, news alerts blared. Clips from the hearing shot across Twitter and Instagram, commentators dissecting body language, experts annotating each remark like play-by-play announcers at a championship game. "Look at her restraint," one analyst said on live television. "She's building a trap." Another whispered, "He's rattled. You can see it in his hands." Even neutral viewers sensed the tilt of power. What had started as routine oversight now felt like a cinematic showdown. By the halfway mark, his polished veneer had developed visible cracks. He shifted in his seat, adjusted his water glass, cleared his throat too many times. Crockett remained motionless, except for her eyes, which tracked him steadily, a metronome of accountability. Every so often she glanced at her notes, but never lost the rhythm of the exchange. The imbalance was palpable, a man accustomed to deference, confronting a woman who owed him nothing, whose questions were backed not by performance, but by lived conviction. As the questioning intensified, a kind of moral geometry emerged in the room. Kavanaugh spoke from above, invoking precedent and authority, but his tone grew brittle. Crockett spoke from beside, invoking lived experience and consequence, her tone unshaken. The audience felt the contrast as more than personality. It was a clash of two Americas, two definitions of justice vying for supremacy in a single hearing. Even Kavanaugh's allies shifted uncomfortably. One aide whispered something behind a hand, another scribbled a note and pushed it toward the bench. He ignored them, jaw tight, eyes fixed forward. Crockett asked her next question, a clean, devastating arc that connected his past rulings to current human impact. The moment landed, he blinked hard, exhaled, and gave a non-answer that fooled no one. The chamber erupted in low murmurs, the online commentary spiking with exclamation marks and fire emojis. And yet, despite his attempts to control the narrative, the gravity of the exchange was slipping from his hands. Crockett had transformed the power dynamic, each question pulling at the thread of his carefully woven image. The tension no longer came from what she might ask, but from how he might respond, whether he could maintain composure under the weight of her calm precision. Then came the moment that would transform a tense hearing into a political earthquake. The chamber held its breath as Jasmine Crockett straightened a single sheet of paper, her fingertips grazing the edge as though she were sharpening a blade. The steady rhythm of her preparation, pen placed down, glasses adjusted, eyes lifted, made the silence feel longer, deeper, more ominous. Even the air vents seemed to hush. Kavanaugh tried to stare her down, but there was a flicker, a blink too slow, a pulse visible at the side of his neck. He knew something was coming. Everyone did. "Judge Kavanaugh," she began, her voice low, deliberate. "In your sworn testimony last year, you claimed no communication with outside interest groups regarding the Madison decision. Yet our records show multiple calls between your chambers and an organization under federal investigation for influencing judicial outcomes. How do you reconcile your statement with these documented calls?" A thunderclap in human form. Reporters jolted upright. Some gasped audibly, the sound ricocheting off the oak-paneled walls. The question hung there, suspended, a loaded weight dangling over the bench. Kavanaugh's mouth opened, then closed. He reached for his water glass, but stopped halfway, as if even that gesture would be captured in 1,000 GIFs. His face flushed, a blotchy red rising from his collar. Congresswoman, I'm not sure what records you're referring to," he said finally, his voice carrying the tremor he couldn't quite hide. "I'd have to review the—" She didn't blink. "We've already placed them into the record. Dated calls, logged times, your staff, your office. Would you like me to read them aloud?" A murmur surged through the crowd like a tide. Staffers shifted nervously behind him. One aide whispered furiously into another's ear. In the gallery, a young woman covered her mouth, eyes wide. The stenographer's keys clacked faster, as if even the transcript wanted to keep up. Kavanaugh exhaled sharply, attempting to regain his old courtroom composure. "I'm not sure it's appropriate to—" "Judge," Crockett interrupted, "it's a yes or no question. Did you or did you not have those conversations?" The cameras zoomed in, their lenses focusing on his face with surgical precision. His eyes darted toward his lawyers, then back at her. I don't recall," he stammered. "I'd have to check." A ripple of disbelief rolled through the audience. Social media feeds exploded with side-by-side screenshots of his past testimony and the log Crockett had just referenced. Hashtags began to trend in real time. Hashtag caught in the call. Hashtag Crockett checkmate. Hashtag yes or no. TikTok clips paired the footage with ominous bass drops. Meme accounts overlaid popcorn emojis, and commentators scrambled to live stream their reactions. Crockett's tone remained surgical. "You don't recall? Because your staff signed off on these calls, Judge. They went directly to your private line. Were you unaware of your own staff's actions?" Kavanaugh leaned forward, gripping the microphone. "This is an ambush," he said, his voice rising, losing its careful polish. "You're twisting facts to smear me." She tilted her head slightly, her expression almost sympathetic. "Facts aren't a smear, Judge. They're facts. And I'm giving you an opportunity, right now, to explain." The room quaked with murmurs, a low thunder of collective astonishment. Even his allies on the panel sat rigid, hands clasped, eyes darting between the two of them. A camera panned across their faces, tight-lipped, pale, avoiding eye contact. Crockett leaned in a fraction closer. "Let me be clear," she said. "These calls were about a case that could change the rights of millions of Americans. If a sitting judge engages in off-record communications with a group under federal investigation, that's not just inappropriate, it's a betrayal of the public trust. Do you stand by your earlier sworn testimony?" The question hit harder than the first. Kavanaugh's jaw worked, but no sound came. He shuffled his papers, eyes scanning for an escape route that wasn't there. I'd need to consult with counsel," he muttered at last. Crockett allowed a beat of silence, letting his words sink in. Then, with debating calm, she said, "The public deserves clarity, Judge, not evasions." The room erupted with murmurs, a low thunder of collective astonishment.
Reporters dashed out to file urgent updates. Texts flew between newsrooms. Cable networks cut into regular programming with breaking news banners. Across the country, phones buzzed with alerts. Commentators went live from their studios, narrating his faltering response with the glee of people witnessing a political earthquake. In the digital sphere, reaction was instantaneous. Split-screen videos juxtaposed his past confident denials with his current flustered stammering. "She nailed him," one prominent activist tweeted. "This is why we elect fighters." Memes flooded Instagram showing Crockett dropping a microphone, Kavanaugh rendered in caricature as a toppled statue. Even late-night comedians began scripting monologues before the hearing had ended, sensing a cultural moment too potent to miss. Inside the chamber, the energy flipped completely. Kavanaugh, once the unshakable jurist, now looked cornered. His voice, when it came, was defensive, clipped, and peppered with phrases like "taken out of context" and "mischaracterized," each one landing weaker than the last. Crockett, meanwhile, appeared untouched, her poise growing as his confidence unraveled. She pressed once more, a final question to seal the moment. "Judge Kavanaugh, if you cannot give a straight answer under oath, how can the public trust you to give fair rulings from the bench?" Silence. Cameras rolled. The country waited. He swallowed hard, eyes darting. "I have always acted with integrity," he said, but the words came out thin, like a rehearsed line spoken on the wrong stage. Crockett let the silence bloom again. She glanced down at her notes, then back up at him. "The record will reflect your answer," she said simply, her tone the verbal equivalent of closing a case file. And in that instant, the power dynamic shifted permanently. It was no longer a congresswoman questioning a judge. It was the embodiment of public accountability confronting entrenched privilege. Every screen broadcasting the exchange became a mirror of a larger national reckoning. People in living rooms, offices, and subway cars felt it. The moment an untouchable facade cracked. Even the body language in the room transformed. Staffers behind Crockett exchanged the faintest of smiles. Spectators leaned forward, sensing history crystallizing before their eyes. Kavanaugh sat back, hands clasped too tightly, a man visibly realizing that composure can be a brittle shield when confronted by unassailable facts. As the chairman called for a brief recess, the buzz in the chamber became deafening. Pundits outside clutched their microphones, commentators spoke over one another on live feeds, and social media convulsed with the digital equivalent of a standing ovation. Crockett herself remained seated, jotting a quiet note on her legal pad, her expression serene, almost meditative. The clip of her question and his falter looped endlessly online. Within minutes, someone set it to dramatic music, another to a triumphant brass score. Young viewers stitched their own reactions into TikTok videos, pointing to Crockett as a model of calm power. Progressive groups used the moment as a rallying cry, sending fundraising texts within seconds. The hearing had spilled out of the room and into the bloodstream of a movement. And yet Crockett gave no outward sign of triumph. She simply gathered her papers and prepared for what was next, as if this had all been inevitable. Her calm under pressure became its own spectacle, a masterclass in control. While Kavanaugh looked smaller now, hunched, she appeared larger, not elevated by arrogance, but by clarity. But if you thought the moment ended there, you haven't seen what happened once the cameras rolled outside the chamber.
By the time the hearing recessed, the clip had already become digital lightning. Within minutes, every major platform pulsed with the same grainy, gripping footage. Crockett leaning in, Kavanaugh faltering, the question landing like a hammer strike. Hashtags exploded across timelines. Crockett checkmate, Mike drop justice, Kavanaugh calls, each one a neon sign marking the moment's cultural takeover. Twitter threads unspooled with annotated breakdowns. TikTok creators slowed the footage to half speed, setting it to suspense tracks and triumphant crescendos. Instagram pages filled with split screens and looping reels, while Reddit threads parsed every micro-expression like scholars poring over sacred texts. Cable news channels interrupted regular programming. Graphics blared "Historic Clash on Capitol Hill" and "Crockett versus Kavanaugh, the question that shook Washington." Panelists debated in real time, but even the most cautious analysts admitted the visual was devastating for Kavanaugh, a once impervious figure now visibly rattled. Progressive commentators framed it as the symbolic end of an era of unchecked privilege. Conservative pundits scrambled for talking points, alternately claiming entrapment, misinterpretation, or media bias. But the momentum of the narrative had already shifted, and they were running to catch up. In living rooms and offices, group texts buzzed with screenshots. Supporters posted their own reactions, tears, cheers, and proud declarations that someone had finally spoken the truth aloud. Union leaders and grassroots organizers quoted Crockett's words in their newsletters. Local community groups shared the clip at evening meetings, pointing to it as proof that public service could still mean courage. For a progressive-leaning, immigrant-friendly audience, long starved for validation, it felt like a watershed moment, a reminder that grit and preparation could puncture even the most fortified facade. Celebrities jumped in within hours. An Oscar-winning actress posted a 3-word tweet, "Queen, just Queen." A platinum-selling musician shared the clip on her Instagram story with the caption, "Accountability looks like this." Even a retired sports legend weighed in, calling Crockett's composure MVP-level clutch. Each endorsement amplified the reach, drawing in audiences far beyond the political junkies who usually track committee hearings. This wasn't just a story, it was a spectacle, a cultural lightning rod charged with identity and justice. By the second day, late-night hosts were rewriting their opening monologues around the exchange. One recreated the moment with actors in a slow-motion gavel drop. Another joked that Crockett had turned a hearing into a masterclass in civic jujitsu. Memes evolved into art, murals sketched on sidewalks, posters printed for rallies, digital illustrations framing Crockett as a modern-day icon of truth. For every share, the story gained new dimensions, not just about Kavanaugh's stumble, but about the possibility of a different kind of power. Meanwhile, critics scrambled to contain the fallout. Think tank op-eds appeared overnight accusing Crockett of grandstanding. Cable hosts on rival networks framed her question as an ambush and called for a review of committee procedures. Yet even their indignation seemed to validate her impact. The louder the backlash, the more her supporters crowed that she had struck a nerve. "If they're this upset, imagine how guilty he must be," one viral tweet said. In news panels played the clip again and again, parsing every detail, like a crucial moment in a championship game. Body language experts weighed in on Kavanaugh's flushed face and tightened grip. Former prosecutors praised Crockett's precision. A constitutional scholar on primetime called it the most consequential question asked in a decade of hearings. Every replay, every chyron, every push notification deepens the groove of the narrative, the hero versus the gatekeeper, and the hero winning. In city centers and college campuses, small rallies broke out. Students chalked Crockett's quotes on sidewalks. Community leaders organized teach-ins about judicial ethics and public accountability. Online fundraisers in her name surged as grassroots donors chipped in $5, $10, $20 at a time, each contribution a digital cheer. Emails poured into her office, thousands of notes from people who said they felt seen, represented, vindicated. Even beyond the partisan trenches, something shifted. Pollsters reported an overnight spike in name recognition for Crockett. Focus groups showed independents impressed not just by her question, but by her composure. Editorial boards, once lukewarm, wrote glowing pieces about a new model of public service. It wasn't just the substance of the question, it was the grace under fire, the unshakable calm, the refusal to be rattled. For many, it embodied the exact opposite of what they saw in Kavanaugh's unraveling. Across the Atlantic, foreign newspapers picked up the story. Headlines in London, Berlin, and Sao Paulo described America's reckoning moment. Clips ran on evening broadcasts in Seoul and Mumbai. Analysts abroad framed it as a microcosm of the broader struggle between entrenched privilege and rising pluralism. The image of a poised woman of color confronting a powerful judge became a global shorthand for democratic accountability. And yet, amid the frenzy, Crockett herself remained measured. She issued a single tweet: "We work for the people. Facts matter." No victory laps, no celebratory interviews. When asked by a local station for comment, she simply said, "I asked a question, now it's up to the system to answer." Her restraint only heightened the aura of integrity, making her appear even more grounded compared to the whirling spectacle she had unleashed. In quiet corners of Washington, aides whispered about what might come next: subpoenas, investigations, or new hearings. Kavanaugh's allies convened emergency meetings. His detractors sharpened their arguments. Rumors spread that committee members were reviewing additional records, preparing for deeper probes. Each leak, each whisper became another headline, feeding the story's momentum.
By the time the echo of the gavel faded, the frenzy outside the chamber had reached a fever pitch. Yet inside, as Representative Jasmine Crockett gathered her notes and stood from her seat, there was no hint of triumphalism. She did not bask in the flashes of cameras or the shouted questions of reporters. Instead, she paused for a brief moment. A moment that would soon be replayed and quoted more than any soundbite from the hearing, and spoke not of scandal or victory, but of principle. She looked out over the crowd of aides, journalists, and colleagues, her voice low but resonant. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about the people who believe our system can still hold the powerful accountable. It's about dignity, and about never being afraid to ask hard questions when they matter most." The words fell like calm rain after a storm, quieting even the rustling of papers. Some in the audience blinked back tears, realizing they had just witnessed not only a confrontation, but a recentering of civic values. Her statement reframed the entire confrontation. It was no longer about whether Judge Kavanaugh had stumbled or whether she had scored a political victory. It was about the simple, radical act of questioning authority and the courage it takes to do so. Crockett spoke of her grandmother, who had taught her to stand up straight even when the room wants you to sit, of community elders who had drilled into her that public service is not about the title, but about the trust. She invoked the immigrant families who still believed in the promise of fairness, the workers who felt invisible in courtrooms like this one, the young people who wondered whether their voices could ever matter. As she spoke, her tone shifted from personal to universal, weaving together a narrative that transcended party lines and demographics. "Power," she said, "is not permanent. Titles fade, appointments expire. But dignity? Dignity belongs to the people. Justice belongs to the people. The truth belongs to the people." Her words drew murmurs of assent from unexpected corners of the room. Even some who had opposed her in principle now found themselves moved by the clarity of her conviction. She did not call for outrage, she called for vigilance. She did not frame the moment as a takedown, she framed it as a lesson. You don't have to shout to make history. Sometimes you just have to stand your ground, ask the question, and let the truth speak for itself. The statement was not just an epilogue to the day's events. It was an invocation, a reminder of what democracy accountability can look like when stripped of theatrics and restored to its original intent. Outside, her words reverberated almost instantly. Headlines shifted from the spectacle to the substance. Crockett turns clash into call for justice, and from question to credo, the speech that elevated the hearing.
On social media, clips of her statement outperformed even the original confrontation, reshared by educators, pastors, and community leaders who saw in it a teachable moment about integrity and public service. Commentators noted how rare it was for a politician to resist gloating in victory, and how that restraint lent her moral authority. For the millions who had watched the confrontation unfold, her closing remarks provided a release, a way to translate adrenaline into purpose. It wasn't just validation they were feeling anymore. It was inspiration. Parents played her speech to their children. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. Activists quoted it at rallies. Crockett's words transformed a clash into a case study in courage under fire. And as she left the chamber, she wasn't just a representative anymore. She had become a symbol.
In the wake of that extraordinary exchange, the clip you've just watched isn't only a viral moment, it's a turning point. Representative Jasmine Crockett's single, searing question to Judge Kavanaugh shattered the script of business-as-usual politics and reminded millions that even the most entrenched power can be questioned. You've seen the gasps, the hashtags, the ripple effects across newsrooms and timelines. But beyond the spectacle, this is about you, about everyone who believes dignity and truth still matter in public life. Moments like this don't happen in isolation. They happen because ordinary people demand better, share the truth, and refuse to let the powerful write the only narrative. Crockett's calm courage under fire shows that our institutions can still work when we push them to, that accountability still matters, and that questions can be louder than any gavel strike. If this moment spoke to you, if it reminded you of the power of standing up, even when the odds feel stacked, then don't let it fade as another headline. Join the conversation. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Add your voice in the comments and tell us what you think this moment means for America's future. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel, because we're going to keep bringing you stories that lift the curtain, stories that dramatize not just conflict, but courage, stories that show you what happens when everyday people challenge power. If you believe in truth over power, hit subscribe, because this is just the beginning.